Hi everyone, we'll make a start now. Thanks very much all for coming. This is the final one of our series of Research Hive seminars for this term. We're going to be looking at issues around reproducible research for this one. So I'd just like to welcome our speakers. We have Professor Zoltan Dienes, who is experimental psychology, and we have Janet Boddy, who's Professor of Child, Youth and Family Studies. So thanks very much both of you to agreeing to come and talk today. I'll get your slides up, Zoltan, first. So we'll have both presentations and then we'll have discussion afterwards, if that's okay.
So I'd like to talk about transparency as a sort of a theme by which we could look at various reforms that I think could and should and are in some cases happening in academia. So there is a tradition of acquiring knowledge whereby a person offers a solution and gives reasons for the solution and says, please criticise it, maybe you can do better. And that's what Popper called the critical tradition, which I think is a good way of characterising, if slightly idealistic, what we're doing in academia and science, and what makes it different from other traditions in which try and acquire knowledge, in which the master says, here's my solution, now you better believe it. So transparency is obviously at the basis of this, because if you're going to offer a solution and reasons and say, please criticise it, then the reasons need to be on the table and all the information relevant to making a decision about it needs to be on the table. So transparency, seen in that light, means relevant information is readily accessible. So that's the way I'm going to look at transparency. And I'm going to presume that the way you make good decisions is by integrating information, and therefore a precondition of that is transparency, so that all the information is not just somewhere out there, but actually accessible and being used. And that principle applies at sort of every level at which university works. And I'll go through data materials code, studies and universities to think about how traditionally we haven't been doing it quite right, and what we need is some more transparency, and then maybe we'll make some better decisions. So data materials and code. I first got involved in transparent data, transparent materials, transparent code, which means essentially that you make your data available, publicly available, and you make your materials publicly available, and you make your code publicly available at the point of submission of a paper. So it's therefore available for anyone to criticise what you're doing and to see if there's any faults in your arguments, and to see if they can do it better. Well, that sounded to me like a great idea way before I started doing it. Like a lot of these things. And then Richard Moray set up something that, I have to say, seems a little bit quaint now, but it wasn't so long ago that I signed up to this, the Peer Reviewers Openness Initiative, which is, when you sign up to this, which I did, it means, as a reviewer, if you get a paper to review, and the data are not uploaded in a publicly available repository like the Open Science Framework, you say, I want the data either uploaded or a statement in the paper saying why they can't do it. And until that happens, I will not go any further with my review. And the reason why I thought this was a brilliant idea was every time I got a review to do, I just had to write one line and my review was done. So I thought this was a brilliant way of feeling holier than thou and doing no work. But once you've signed up to such an initiative, which I signed up to first, a little bit of cognitive dissonance happens and you think, well, really I should be putting my data online at the point of submission whenever I submit a paper. And so I first signed up to the review and then very quick to the initiative, and then very shortly afterwards I sort of laid down as a precondition, my name is only on a paper if the data is uploaded at the point of submission of the paper, so it's fully transparent, and materials and code. And I've had that rule ever since. For any co-author who wants to co-author with me, I say that's fine, but I have this rule. And that way that encourages other people, whoever wishes to co-author with me, to sort of get their act together, make their data transparent, and so on. Or, see, not all data, there's sometimes reasons why data can't be transparent. There can be privacy issues and so on, which I think we'll hear about later. And that's fine, but you need to state a reason why it can't be done if it can't be done. And for the sort of work I do, there never has been such a reason. There is no reason in the cognitive psychologist why the data shouldn't be completely transparent. Now, when I came to prepare this talk, I noticed the date here, 2016. That's not so long ago. We're only just into 2019. And although it was great when I first signed up, and in 2016 my review load sort of massively went down with just a few sentences each time. Now it turns out I have to review properly all the papers I get because people are uploading the data at the point of submission. Partly, I think, as a lot of journals now demand it. But that's how fast things have changed. And that's why this seems, at least in my field of psychology, a little bit quaint to me now, just in the space of really a couple of years. But I think there's going to be a lot of divergence between different disciplines in quite how rapidly they're embracing the reform agenda. And maybe psychology, I think some disciplines like physics have done it a lot earlier than us, but maybe psychology is ahead of some others because of the credibility crisis that was partly focused on psychology. I also, about the same time, I heard what the American Journal of Political Science was doing. So this is a few years ago I heard about this, and I thought, wow, that's really good. It does seem a little bit quaint now for reasons I'll mention. But what they do is you have to, for any materials you put there, like a graph, you have to present them with the data and the code so that their team of editorial assistants can reproduce everything in your paper. So all statistics and graphs have to be reproducible by the team. And if it's not, they get back to you and make sure everything does line up. So I think that's a fantastic source of checking. And mistakes, obviously, routinely spotted. But then this year, eLife came out with the first computationally reproducible articles. Now, in this case, you have, for example, a graph, and all the code is there in a way that you can interact with. So if you say, I want to see the standard errors on this graph, and they're not shown, you type in standard errors, and bang, there's your graph of standard errors. So you can play with the graph because the data is there and the code is there. You can make the graph, change the graph to show what you want it to show. So this sort of sets a new sort of gold standard for where we should be heading in terms of reproducibility. So I won't say more about that, but obviously that's in all sorts of disciplines, making your data, materials and code publicly available contributes to the critical tradition, because no one can criticize what you're doing if they can't see what you're doing. It's just a black box. Now, another way where transparency has been lacking, I'll focus on psychology, but it's not just psychology in terms of studies, in that there's a file drawer of studies that never get published. And often that's because the studies get null results. In other words, they don't support some theory, they don't find an effect. So what you have is the publication of studies that do find an effect, but none of the studies that don't find an effect, and you end up with an extremely biased literature. So obviously, in a sense, that's a transparency issue, because there's a biased selection of data, and not all the relevant information is available to the community to make decisions about whether there are side effects, or a drug does work, or a manipulation does do what it says on the tin. So taking some slides from Chris Chambers here. And part of this comes down to a clash between what's good for science and what's good for the scientists. So what's good for science is transparent, high-quality research, regardless of outcome. So good science means you've conducted a rigorous study that addresses an interesting question, but it doesn't matter if the answer is the theory's wrong or the theory's right. But what's good, or historically has been good for scientists, is they get good results. And that's obviously an extremely biasing factor in terms of science, and part of the problem of the file drawer that I just mentioned, which means we don't have full transparency of studies. We don't know all the relevant data. So a solution that, well, the idea has been around for many decades, but Chris Chambers from Cardiff has been particularly energetic in pursuing it. He set up in 2013 a type of article called Registered Reports. And I was on the first editorial team dealing with registered reports, and still on the Cortex one as well as others. So the idea in registered reports, to get around this problem, is that you submit to the journal essentially your introduction method section and your proposed analytic protocol before you've collected the data, so that reviewers consider your experiment before they know what the results are. So if they're partial to a certain theory, well, that's irrelevant to the judgment. They're just judging whether this is a good way of testing the theory. And it also means if there's some flaw in your experiment, you get told about it before you collect the data. So it's very much in the researcher's interest as well, rather than carrying through, collecting the data, and then chasing journal after journal after journal when you realise there's some aspect of it that certain reviewers don't like. So it gets in-principle acceptance before the data are collected, and then you collect the data, and as long as you do what you said you're going to do and analyse it the way you said you're going to analyse it, it virtually guarantees acceptance. And in the 6 years this has been going at Cortex, 100% of papers that have passed stage 1 in principle acceptance, in other words, accepted before the data has been collected, have then been accepted after the data is collected. You just have to do what you said you're going to do for that to happen. So this helps transparency because you no longer have a filtering mechanism that filters out some of the studies, leaving a biased record of what the results are that deal with a particular theoretical issue. And there is evidence that this works. For example, pre-registering happened in medicine before that, not as rigorously as we do in registered reports, which is a very thorough and rigorous process that we go through. But in the context of clinical trials, the number of studies finding medical interventions effective before pre-registration was 55% and after was 8%. So that indicates there was a considerable bias existing. And recently, there's a look at registered reports by David Mealer and Chris Allen, and found that hypotheses are at least 3 times more likely to be disconfirmed in registered reports compared with regular articles, which I'll take to be a sign that it is doing its job in weeding out bias. The process of registered reports can apply to larger data sets. At Cortex, we have a sort of procedure ongoing now where there's we teamed up with the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study, in which 10,000 children will be followed over 10 years with a lot of different types of measures, including brain imaging, genetics, and various other things. So it's absolutely enormous data set that ideally is publicly available and transparent, because there's lots of different hypotheses you could have that this would be relevant to, so you wouldn't want this hidden away. So the data is released as it comes out, but what that means is you can use the data that's already out to try some stuff out on, test some ideas, test some analytic protocols, and use that as a registered report to then have a confirmatory analysis on the data that then follows afterwards. So that's an ongoing process, and just illustrates that huge public data sets can be amenable to this sort of process to eliminate bias and thereby help reduce a lack of transparency of studies in the record. This is just another way of doing it with blind analysis, and the first paper in psychology that used pre-registered blind analyses is this one. But what you do is you don't precisely specify the analytic protocol in advance, but you say how you're going to blind the analyst. You're going to, for example, add random noise to one variable, or permute randomly a certain variable. So the person analysing the data has the data in front of them, or a version of the data, which to try out and explore what sort of analytic procedure would be best suited for this sort of data, but without actually knowing if they're confirming or disconfirming their key hypotheses. So that's a more flexible way of reducing bias than precisely specifying your analytic protocol in advance. Another way of getting rid of this bias in studies is asking journals to take responsibility for the stuff they publish. So Sanjay Srivastava put it this way. He says, journals, you should follow this maxim: you published it, you own it. Meaning, once you've published a study, you are responsible for alerting people to whether that is replicable. So if people try and replicate it and they can't replicate it, or they can replicate it, you should publish that. Now, a publisher did step up to the plate and did take responsibility, and it was the Royal Society, so it has some prestige, and they've just released a policy is that within psychology and neuroscience, any replication of any study that they publish will be published within Royal Society Open Source. In fact, they took even more responsibility. They said a whole swathe of journals, if you try and replicate from any of these journals that they listed, we'll publish your replication. So that is an enormous change of attitude compared to, I think, 10 years ago, where journals were extremely reluctant to publish null results because it would harm their impact factor. So here's another problem with transparency, is making sure everyone, all relevant people, can see your work, open access. Libraries like our one, I don't know the exact figures, but something like more than £1 million for, say, Elsevier, and I don't know what it is for. We pay enormous sums of money to publishers for the work we did. Apparently, I read a Guardian article. It was Robert Maxwell who realised this was a great way to make money. He said, "Yeah, if you want prestige, sunshine, you better publish in my journal," and it worked. We're willing to pay enormous sums of money for the work we did just to get prestige. So clearly, that isn't a great solution for us. We've been fleeced and continue to be fleeced. So a better solution is something like an overlay journal. The trouble with open access, with the standard publishers, is we then pay them even more money, and we're fleeced even more to make it open access, and then we get all of these fake journals coming around, right? Just want to make some money and don't do any reviewing and so on. But if you have an overlay journal, you get around this. You use an online archive like Archive or Site Archive, BioArchive, and so on, to publish. Editors, for example, select reviewers to review, and articles are openly available for community review and comment. All reviews are public. It all happens on a public archive. Reviewers give a score, and then if it's good enough, it's accepted in that overlay journal. And then this is virtually free, and the running costs, you need some programmers and so on, wouldn't be that great, and could be a consortium of universities could easily cover it. And that, in one fell swoop, would save the university millions and millions. They just need to reinvest a little bit in programmers' time. That hasn't. I think the first one was 2016. So what we need is a way of getting to that from the current situation, where people are afraid of just publishing all the work in an overlay journal, because they say, yeah, but what about my career? I need, there's the ref and all this sort of thing. Peer community in various subjects is sort of an in-between version. It's run by some French universities who just put a small amount of money for programming to run this. You submit your preprint to it, it's sent to review, and there's a process by which the article is accepted in PCI. But then what's happened, rather than thinking of that as a journal, it's offered to journals and said, here's a paper that's been pre-reviewed and accepted. Here are the reviews and the editorial letters. What do you reckon? And certain journals have sort of said, we will strongly consider the output of this process, and then sometimes accept papers just as they are with reviews already done. So with Chris Chambers and PCI, we're looking to do registered reports this way, whereby the team at Cortex or Royal Society Open Science, which includes me and Chris and some others, will take papers through registered reports to the final stage, and then we'll say to journals, look, we've done the process, we're the editors who do it on Cortex and Royal Society, you can trust us. I know you don't run registered reports now, you don't have the infrastructure and so on to do it, but you can do it now. You just take it from us if you want this article. We've already been through the editorial process. And then journals can bid with each other and compete for articles. So it changes the power balance somewhat. So that's something under discussion, ongoing right now. Transparency of books. So I don't know why the University of Sussex doesn't just set up a University of Sussex Press. I've got a mate who self-published his own book. Very good quality. He was in martial arts. Much better quality than most of the self-published books I see on Amazon. But I can see a single person can self-publish a brilliantly produced product. So if my mate can do it, I reckon the University of Sussex can do it. So they could, for example, if I write a book, I could say to the university, just stamp it University of Sussex Press. You produce some hard copies. We can advertise it by various means. I can put it on the conference circuit and speakers write reviews of it and so on. Why don't you take 50% of profits? I take 50% of the profits. Now, the final issue of transparency I want to talk about. Oh, I should say with that one, you could also, in the interest of full transparency, put a PDF free online if people want the information. I like to have books to read. I'm not fully electronic-sized. So I'd often be happy to buy a book. Universities. So now, sort of more older people will know there's been a dramatic change in the structure of universities in the last 10 years, where we went from a relatively democratic system to a very much a top-down system. Now, what I want to consider in the context of this is considering the same sort of notion of transparency we've been talking about, means relevant information is readily accessible. What organizational structure produces transparency? What organizational structure means you can integrate information maximally across different parts of the organization. So here, I'll take some propositions and see what you think. Each academic has information about how the university is working. We're not like a car production line where each person just has to do a job that they're told. We're actually sources of information of how the system is working. But each of us will have different relevant information, different little bits of the university, things are going differently. Now, it's all very well the information being there with me or you in the bit of the university you're in, but we need it to be used somehow, and it will be used if you have to make decisions that make a difference. Now, also, I'll just add this in, those are the important desiderata, but those decisions will make best use of the information if people making the decisions have to live by them. So if you're going to say the university has to expand at a massive rate, but you don't actually have to deal with the consequences on the ground yourself, that's one thing. If you have to deal with the consequences on the ground yourself, that's another thing. Now, the way we work in academia is we don't really select people. We select ideas. That's what happens in science. We don't have a guru. We say, here's an idea, and in principle, a postgraduate student can criticise a Nobel Prize winner, and in principle, if the argument carries through, it's the ideas that win. So, and I think that's the best way of integrating information, is selecting ideas rather than people. So let's have a look at how things are run now. We've senior management who tell the deans what to do, tell the schools what to do. I was on teaching and learning committees up to about 4 years ago, and I can tell you how it operated there was the Pro VC told the committee what it thought, and then the committee told the schools what to do. Okay. So that's how it is. Is that a great way of integrating information? Let's say we introduce a little bit of information in here. Will that propagate through the system and be made use of? I wrote a letter to council before the current VC was brought on board, and asked council if it might consider a radical experiment in an altogether different type of institutional organisation. I've been impressed by reading a book by Josh Ober, Company of Citizens, in which he took ideas from Athenian democracy and together with a management consultant, Brooke Manville, had used them to restructure organisations to run in more democratic ways. And we invited Josh Ober over to Sussex and gave some talks back then. He talked about how back in ancient Greece there was 1,000 states with different competing systems, some of them democratic like the Athenian ones, others with top-down control. And what was really interesting is now with some archaeological work that's been done just fairly recently, we can tell with sort of fairly objective means which of these systems outperformed others. And it was the democratic states that outperformed in terms of cultural flourishing and economy, the ones with top-down control, which maybe isn't what one would expect by the bad press democracy sometimes gets. And Josh also described how the principles had been put into practice in institutions, so this isn't just pie in the sky, it's something that's really been tried out in organisations that continue to use those principles often decades later. And they work particularly well in knowledge institutions like universities. My way of looking at this was we wanted, I didn't want to copy other institutions. You know, I heard management saying, these are our competitors, this is what they're doing, let's copy them and maybe we can storm ahead of the crowd. I'd rather Sussex was a beacon for others, not a follower. Got lots of signatures. I just emailed some people I thought would be interested in it. They said, yeah, we support that. And then it was obviously promptly ignored by council. So this is my last slide. I've probably been carrying on a bit long, but this is my last slide. So the idea is that, I think we can introduce democracy in a lot of different ways. Personally, I'd favour a very radical solution so that we can be an example to others. We don't follow what other people are doing. We don't say, oh, let's look at these other people, see what they're doing. We do what we think is best. And then other people say, wow, look at what Sussex is doing. So you could get rid of specific senior management. The Athenians didn't have a leader per se. They had committees that made decisions, and the members of those committees were selected by sortition, random lot. Not necessarily random lot from the whole citizen body, although it could be, but they could be, you could have some pre-qualifications. I mean, you might want to say senior lecturer and above for certain things, or whatever the case may be. So this is why Ober described his way of looking at it, a company of citizens. We'll become citizens of the university, and we would be the people managing it. We could be selected into, by random lot, various committees. Once we've done our duty for a time, we would have a period of grace before we could be selected again. We could incorporate key proposals. Could be in Athens, the Assembly of Citizens was the whole citizen body would vote on proposals and decide to confirm them or not. The proposals would be made by an executive committee. It was of 500 in the Athenian system, so you wouldn't have 500, but we could have an executive committee that sort of worked up proposals that gave to an Assembly of Citizens who made decisions. But this needn't be the whole citizen body of the university. Fishkin developed this idea of deliberative democracy, which is very interesting, and I think would help us with our Brexit problem. What he does is he randomly selects from a population, it could be all of Europe, he's done, for example, or a town in China, or Northern Ireland. And he goes to great effort to, when you've randomly selected people, you make sure they come as much as possible. She needs childcare. Okay, we'll pay for the childcare. Enormous amount of resources put into making the sample representative, which doesn't always work perfectly, but it's impressive how much he makes it work. And then you get a few hundred people together, and they form small groups of maybe 15 to 20, and over a long weekend or a week, sometimes televised, sometimes not, they're given information packs from the different points of view, and they sit and discuss it, and they have the information there. And then there's a panel of experts they can ask later to ask questions to from the different competing views to get answers to questions they haven't had answered yet. And then they vote. So the way Fishkin puts this is this is how the citizens would vote on an issue if they had reflected for some time, maybe a week, and given information. So that's a sort of a different notion of democracy, which I think would work better than another referendum. I think that would be a really good way of doing a second Brexit. Politicians clearly can't decide, right? So let's have some citizen assemblies to decide what should happen with Brexit. So anyway, that's a nice book to read on that. And we could have sort of work groups like that as well. I mean, do we need senior managers? Why don't we become the citizens and manage a university? Now, in a system like this, where the whole citizen body is being recirculated through all the different committees in a constant way, and they're the one making decisions, it's integrated information in the sense you put a bit of information here somewhere. This has a much better chance of that information propagating than top-down control. So I think transparency is really important, and we've started addressing it in various ways, but I think transparency is something that needs to affect university life and academic life and scientific life much more than it has been today. And we're making enormous strides, and as I said before, the change has happened just over a few years, at least in some disciplines, is really heartening, but I can also see a long way to go. But I hope now we've got some momentum that will carry on in that direction. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dave. We'll move on to Janet, and we'll take questions at the end, if that's okay.
Well, thank you. I feel like I'm going to struggle to concentrate on what I'm going to say now. I mean, I might rather have a conversation about how we democratise the university. I love those ideas. I'm delighted to be here. I have to say I was a bit unsure when Suzanne asked me about how ideas of reproducibility apply to my own research, which tends to narrative qualitative methods. I should say I direct our Centre for Innovation and Research in Childhood and Youth, which is a cross-disciplinary, cross-university research centre. And we have a kind of strand of our thinking about what we describe as being imaginative methodology, which means trying to think differently about how you might imagine methodological approaches, whether that's in history, whether that's in law, whether that's in psychology, whether that's in sociological research, for example, to think about how you put the child and young person at the centre of your thinking, which is our kind of one of the things that connects our centre, whatever disciplinary perspective, whatever kind of approach you're working with. And lots of my own work involves either mixed methods studies or the work that I do personally is narrative qualitative work, often using kind of creative and participatory approaches with young people. So I think this posed really interesting questions for me about what does reproducibility mean in that context, because I think the drive from it has very much come from kind of pure science and ideas of replicability in that context. So I thought that what would be useful today is just to kind of reflect a bit from my experience and think about partly what the context for it is, but also then what that means for people like me who work in methodological traditions that don't intuitively seem to lend themselves to ideas of replicability or reproducibility. So I suppose one question is about whether we're interested in reproducibility simply because we have to be, because funders require this, because increasingly journals might be asking us to think about this. And so this is the ESRC data management policy in the guidance for grant holders, which sets out transparent and reproducible research are two established principles of good research practice, which also extend to the data collected or produced. So that ties to what Zoltan's been saying. And ESRC also, as a default, expects data to be archived. So they expect your data to be available for other researchers for reuse. Louise Corty from the UK Data Archive has blogged about this. It's quite a useful blog. I put the link in here, and I'm happy for the slides to be shared if people want them. It's based on a session she ran at the last NCRM Research Methods Festival. That's the ESRC National Centre for Research Methods. And as she argues here, there's an increasing drive for openness, for transparency, as part of research integrity. And we have to recognise that, but we also have to recognise the value of it and how much we can learn from each other about sharing data. So she makes this quite bold statement that this does apply to everybody, that every researcher can share something from their methods and data, and we need to be ready to come up with positive arguments and solutions. And I guess partly from my perspective, I want to talk a bit about work I've done in this field, but I think I started out as being quite sceptical about data reuse and data sharing for the kind of qualitative work that I do. And my position through my experience of doing different studies has shifted. So I just want to give you a bit of an illustration of that, some of my scepticism, but also some of what I see of the value in it and the necessary considerations for it. So if archiving data is increasingly prioritised by funders and the research councils especially, this is from ESRC again, and their research data policy clearly sets out that the data are the main assets of research. And I think that's a really interesting, bold statement. It's the data, it's not all our intellectual work around the papers that we write or the books that we write. It's the data that is the main asset for them. So, as grant holders, ESRC expect us to generate scientifically robust data ready for further reuse. And reproducibility is part of that, but it's not the only reason for it. So there are economic and pragmatic arguments for data sharing and data reuse. This is public money, after all, alongside arguments about transparency and integrity. And those arguments about the economic and the pragmatic benefits, I think, apply across methodologies. They apply across research paradigms, making best use of public money, allowing other researchers to benefit, other researchers to learn from the public investment in your research. And I think that's something that's interesting, just thinking about what Zoltan's saying about democracy. If your data are available, if I think about our BA childhood and youth students, for example, they're often interested in their dissertations in studying quite complex, quite sensitive topics. But there's no way that they would have the research training, the time, the experience to go out and do interviews with young people in care, for example, if I take one of my areas of work. But if they can do secondary analysis of that, they can learn from that. It opens up possibilities of different resources for learning. It stops that work being purely in the domain of the privileged, experienced few. You know, there are different kinds of privilege. So there's value in that, but ESRC do recognise that it's a variable picture. So here they say, well, we strongly advocate further reuse of data. We also recognise that some research data are more sensitive than others, and believe it's the responsibility of the grant holder to consider all issues related to confidentiality, ethics, security and copyright before initiating the research. So when you apply for funding, you not only have to say if you're not planning to archive your data, you have to give a justification for that in relation to these issues. And it may be, and I can talk more about this in the discussion as we did with one study that I've done, that you archive your data partially. So we archived some cases, actually nobody completely in full, because we had maps and so on that were just too identifiable, and if you took the identifying data off, you know, a map with no information on it is just a picture of lines, isn't it? But, you know, so we didn't archive everything, we didn't archive every case, and that was fine. We had to make a case for that. They wanted everything, but we were able to argue that. So there's kind of recognition of that, and I think we also need to, as Louise Corti was saying, we need to think about what might be the substantive, the methodological benefits of this. So again, not just about integrity, not just about reproducibility, but thinking how, I think for me particularly interesting, how we can use existing data sets to complement and contextualize. So you could use a secondary source in conjunction with new primary data collection to help you. And we did this with one study where we started out working with a qualitative data set from India and used our learning from that to design a cross-national study in India and the UK. So it helped us to start our thinking from India rather than imposing a minority world interpretation of what the important issues would be. So it can enhance primary data collection, allow you to make new understandings so you can link data sets across time and place. And that, I think, helps you to think about, and I'll come back to this, to think about how knowledge is constructed, to think about historical contexts, to think about social and political contexts for the work that we do, to recognise that knowledge isn't politically neutral, but is always situated in space and time. And work with the archive can allow you to do that, but that only works if people are willing to share their data, to make their data open. So I think I've kind of hinted at this already. It's not as straightforward as funders may assume, and I think part of my anxiety about this, and Zoltan and I were talking beforehand about data openness and transparency, and getting resistance from some of my colleagues in my school saying, oh, that wouldn't work for what I do. So I think part of that concern comes from questions about data ownership, thinking about the intellectual property, but also thinking about the emotional labour that's involved in the work. So if I'm doing, as I did recently, I did an interview with a woman whose children had been taken into care and adopted, and it was one of her children's birthdays, the day that I did the interview. And I sat with her for, instead of being there for an hour and a half, I was there for about 3 hours, letting her talk, listening. Is that my emotional labour? And then going back to my hotel room in the town where I was doing the field work, is that something that the funder owns? Is my emotional work their public asset? Or is that something that's more personal to me? So there's something about the construction of qualitative data in relationships that does make this feel different, I think. We have questions of data protection, of freedom of information, And that, I think, relates to that kind of final point about what anonymisation means in complex and distinctive qualitative data sets. So when I've got photographs that participants have taken, when I've got maps that families have drawn, if we've got walking interviews where people are describing where they are, how do you anonymise that stuff and still make it in any way meaningful to somebody else who might come in and look at it, who might come in and try and replicate the analysis that you've done? And I think also, because qualitative researchers are very much focused, or usually very much focused on the relational aspects of knowledge construction, there's a lot of concern about what informed consent means, or ideas of informed consent. Actually, ESRC now talk about appropriately informed consent, not fully informed consent in their ethics framework. But what does that mean when future uses are unknown? And I'll give you an example from a study we did some decades after the data were collected, which the original researchers couldn't possibly have imagined that we might come and do that. So in thinking about what reproducibility means for qualitative inquiry, I think we need a kind of balance. So there's one point here that Clive Seal made, that there's almost a kind of creation mythology that comes about around qualitative research, where people make overdrawn contrasts with the supposed positivism of quantitative work. So, is there any, in principle, reason why that critical tradition that Zoltan was talking about would not be important in the work that I do? Is the work that I do somehow so special that people shouldn't be able to challenge my analytic interpretations, shouldn't be allowed to look at the data that I gather? But so we have to be really careful about not producing some false binary, and recognising lots of us do mixed methods research anyway, which doesn't fit easily into one camp. But it's essential, I think, that we recognise epistemological differences. And Ivona Lincoln has written about this. And what she suggests is that, what she says, accumulation of knowledge in a positivist paradigm is relatively straightforward. I don't think that's quite true. But she uses the metaphor of an edifice, a building, a wall, or a structure of some sort. And you can see within that analogy why reproducibility is so important. You need to make sure that each brick in the wall is a robust foundation for the next stage of building. You need to make sure that there aren't holes in the wall where the null results haven't been reported, for example. But she argues that you need a different metaphor for interpretivist inquiry, where we're still collecting and accumulating knowledge, we're still building on research that's gone before. But the knowledge is assumed to always be situated in time and space, so it always has to be contextualised, and contextualised including in interaction with the researchers who collect the data. So you would never make the assumption that the same data would be collected by a different person on a different day in interaction with the same participant, because it's always constructed within the relationship. And this is quite a long quote, but I couldn't decide where to edit it because I really like it. She says, interpretivist theories are fat with the juice of human endeavour, human decision-making, zaftig with human contradiction, human emotion, human frailty. They do not appeal to pure reason or statistical logic, but rather are derived from pure lived experience. Interpretivist inquiry consequently pleads for a metaphor that is thick, replete with multiple levels of understanding, assembled from many ingredients, and patched together to form new patterns, new images, new languages, rather than extracting what are believed to be a priori patterns. I don't know what the metaphor is, she says. Also, bouillabaisse or gumbo comes the closest. But perhaps the metaphor is a quilt, or a poem, or a double helix. Whatever it is, it's intensely organic, many-layered, what T.S. Eliot called a multifoliate rose. So, you know, I'm a little cautious about this because I don't want to retreat back into that binary that scientific research is all very linear and straightforward and just building one step on the other. But what she's talking about is, I mean, Jennifer Mason's written about this idea of facet methodology. There's an organic quality, a mixing of different forms of knowledge, which is essential in much qualitative inquiry. And I think it does pose an important challenge to our ideas of what reproducibility might look like. And I just want to give a very concrete illustration of that. This is from a cross-national qualitative longitudinal study that we did with young adults who were in care during childhood. And we specifically used methods that helped us to understand their lives from their point of view. We were particularly trying to avoid reductive methods that would define people in terms of the problems that they faced, because there's quite a lot of evidence that that stigmatizes young people who've been in care and actually actively adds to the difficulties they face if you just research within a risk-focused paradigm. So with all of that in mind, we asked people over a pair of interviews about a week apart, we asked them to choose a piece of music that was important to them, that had positive associations for them. And in the second interview, they shared that music with us if they wanted to and talked to us about it. So this was from Maya in Denmark, and I'll just let you, if I can make it work, listen while you read. So when she played the song to the interview, she was talking about how important it was to her to feel that she had the freedom to be honest about her childhood experiences. And this was a tension that she had with her siblings who didn't want to talk about what happened in childhood. And she felt it was very important to her that she could, in order that she could move on. So the song was really important to her as a way of, and this is something that comes up a lot in the data, people recognising emotions within music and the music allowing them to articulate experiences that are very complicated. So it gives us, I think, important insights into the work that she's doing as she's navigating through her early adulthood. But then the interviewer went back and spoke to her a year later, and she reminded her of the music exercise. And Maya said, yes, she could remember doing it, but she couldn't remember what they talked about. She couldn't remember which song it was. And then the interviewer told her what the song was, and she played her this quote. And Maya said, oh, yes, that thing about being honest, that's still a challenge with her siblings. And she actually isn't seeing her siblings so often at the second interview as a result of this tension between them. So that bit of it holds. But she didn't remember that this was her song. And when the interviewer told her about the song, she said, oh, yeah, I guess I was listening to that. I don't really listen to that anymore. I've moved in with my boyfriend now, and we're listening to different things. So it was very much a kind of, this was a moment in her life, and that's what the methods allow us to understand. So aspects of the data stay constant, aspects of the data shift over time. And that's kind of the point of the method, is it gives us access to these kinds of situated insights. So I just wanted to kind of share that, thinking about that in conjunction with Lincoln's metaphor, and about what that means when we think about what reproducibility is in qualitative research. Which aspects of this would we want to be able to reproduce if we returned to the data set? So I just want to kind of hold that example and then very quickly give you an example from another study that I did as part of an ESRC investment called Novella, which stands for Narratives of Varied Everyday Lives and Linked Approaches. And this was led by Anne Phoenix at UCL. And it had 3 core studies, the first 3 here, and I led the first one of those, and then 2 other smaller linked studies. And I'm actually not going to talk about the main study. I can do if people want to hear more later. I want to say a little bit about the Paradata project. And just to say, if you want to know more about it, this is a link to a little film that we made. What the projects all had in common is that they all involved different forms of secondary analysis. Qualitative narrative secondary analysis in some ways. So I just want to say a few words about the Paradata project, the possibilities of Paradata, which was done in collaboration with the NCRM Hub, with Ros Edwards at Southampton, and with Anne and with Heather Elliott. And what we did was to look back at surveys conducted for Peter Townsend's landmark study, which really redefined understandings of poverty, really introduced the idea of understanding poverty as relative, not only absolute. And this was a large household pen and pencil survey, pen and paper survey, with nearly 10,000 people, 3,500 households. In the late 60s, really, they were collecting the data. And one of the things that made this particularly important, and it actually ties to your point about democracy, was that they went to huge lengths to get a representative sample. So some interviewers, who they called converters, were specifically trained to overcome refusals, to try and get people to participate who didn't otherwise want to participate, wouldn't get through an ethics committee now. But as he says here, he talked about wanting to include unusual, odd and extraordinary households, the kinds of people that don't usually take part in research. And he said society is diverse and we're concerned to capture this diversity, and to do that by keeping the number of persons refusing at interview as small as possible. So what we were trying to do was to look at this material, to apply a qualitative narrative analysis to Paradata, to the handwritten marginalia that were on the pen and paper surveys held at the Data Archive in Essex. And so we did a thematic analysis of 69 booklets. There was a booklet per household. And then we sampled 6 of those where we looked at them in more depth. And working on the pen and paper in that way allowed us to look at graphic data, things like placement on a page, relationships with codes, punctuations, emphases, and so on. And you could see different handwritings. You could see, so in this one, I don't know how well you can see here, there's this kind of little map here where they're trying to figure out all the family relationships. And lots of the writing on the front was being done at the LSE by the central research team, whereas things like this were done by the interviewers out in the field. By analysing these data, we got really fascinating insights into the way that they were constructed in a study that's been so historically important in social science understandings and political and social understandings of poverty. But we also get really interesting insights, including ethical insights, into the nature and the burden of large-scale survey interviewing. And I think the kind of historical contextualization that's possible from that is hugely helpful in thinking about how we tackle ethical and methodological challenges today. Because you can see, it gives you a different kind of transparency. You can see how what becomes a point in a quantitative data set is constructed in conversations, is constructed in relationships. So we see people, interviewers, kind of reporting how they were encouraging people. There's one of the bits of paradata that we looked at where the interviewer talks kind of proudly, writes a note about having done the interview standing in the hall with kind of their foot literally in the door because the person didn't really want to do it, but they still managed to get through the interview guide. They still managed to get the data. We wouldn't see that now because everybody knows you're not supposed to do that now. But that doesn't mean that 21st century interviewers, who are still often, as Townsend's workers were, employed on short-term precarious contracts, those people still have the pressure to get their numbers. They still have the pressure to get the data in, to prove to their employers how determined they are. So we can learn about that from understanding this. And we also see interviewers struggling with another ethics issue, which kind of resonates with me sitting in that woman's flat on her daughter's birthday, about where do you draw the boundaries in your role as researcher? So the interviewers in Townsend's study used the paradata to reflect, to document on how they managed those tensions. One spoke of being asked to stay for dinner with a family who had very little money, and he felt like it would be rude to refuse, but he was worried about how little money they had, so he went out and bought them all beer and then came back and had dinner with them with the beer that they couldn't normally afford. And he wrote about this in his performance as a good interviewer. So we get insights into the historical period, we get insights into that historical moment within research methods, understanding the construction of the data at that moment in time, in the same way that we do when we look at Maya's quote. And I think, we might not understand this in terms of reproducibility, but I think we can understand it in terms of transparency. And we can also apply that to thinking about our own research now. There's going to be other researchers who are babies at the moment who 40 years from now will look back at what we're doing in our historical moment. How were people understanding researching politics in the moment of Brexit, when democracy is being eroded by the rise of the far right and so on. We live in an interesting historical time too. So part of thinking about transparency, I think, is recognising ourselves as just being ourselves at one moment in time, and what legacy do we want to leave our science. So I think what I've learned from my work is that there's huge potential value in data archiving and reuse, but it's equally really important to recognise that it's not simple, to recognise complexity, contextual specificity, and ethical sensitivities. So the study, the extract from Maya that I showed you, we won't archive those data. We have people in the study who've had to change their name because of death threats from family. We're not going to put those data into an archive where someone might go looking for them. It's not cheap, it's not quick or an easy way of doing research. To work with secondary material, you really have to go back and understand it, and that maybe is one of the differences from, I can't imagine editorial assistants on the journal that I edit being able to go in and replicate the kind of analysis that you've been doing. They definitely don't pay them enough to do that. But maybe funders are getting better at understanding that, and maybe by not just resisting ideas of transparency, ideas of reproducibility and data sharing, maybe we can help funders to learn to understand. And I think there's a growing body of really interesting methodological work. So my colleague Rachel Thompson is doing a project at the moment where she's revisiting an archive of data from a project that she worked on in the 90s and taking that data back to the community where the data were collected and working out, well, how do you give ownership of those data to the community instead of it belonging to the privileged researchers? What would be the ethical ways of doing that, of managing that, turning an academic data set into a community archive? How could you do that? So, you know, I think it's really important that if we're open to this, then we become open to thinking creatively. I was talking about this work in Norway, and I had really interesting discussions with researchers there who work with indigenous communities in northern Norway, and they were saying that completely makes sense to them. Why do we own the data? Why don't our participants own the data? So reproducibility might be paradigm specific, but transparency, I think, can help all of us. So thank you. I'll stop there.